This episode, I'm joined by Jakob Lusensky to discuss the work of Carl Jung in relation to Christianity. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you'd like to support the podcast and keep everything running, as it runs off donations alone, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Jakob Lusensky, thanks very much for joining me on the Hermitix podcast.
Nice to be here.
We are broadly going to be discussing the work of Carl Jung, and then Jung in relation to Christianity and the cross, as per the name of your fairly well-known Jungian podcast, Psychology and the Cross. So that's going to be the broad discussion, is Carl Jung and Jungian psychoanalysis in relation to Christ and Christianity. But before we dive into this very deeply symbolic topic, tell us a little bit about yourself, what it is you do, and how you got into the work of Jung.
Well, so I'm a Jungian analyst working in Berlin in private practice since about a decade or like 10, 12 years now. So I got into Jung as a patient. That's like, that must be 15 years ago now. So I was living in Sweden, in Stockholm, and I was working with something very different, music industry and many, many different things. Quite active life, and but I wasn't doing great. So I started to look for a cure, and I guess I started to connect with Jung through reading. So I went to these old bookstores and started to dig up Jung. He wasn't very popular at the time in Sweden. Now he had like a upswing the last 10 years, but back then he was more like kind of, if not forgotten, not many people paid attention to him actually. So I started reading, and I felt like he had understood something, and it made me feel better understood, and I could start to think about myself in a different way. And the next step was to see if there was any Jungian analysts alive in Sweden, in Stockholm at the time, and there were a few, but not many. It's still a very, very small community in Sweden. And so I went into analysis, and it kind of was a process where I stopped, sort of started to put down my old life in a way, and leaving my job and the city. And I went to Zurich, not with the ambition to become an analyst at all, but actually with the idea of writing a book, which I also did, but not the book that I thought I would write. So I went to Zurich with this idea, okay, I had the luxury to spend time on going into analysis and write a book, but the book sort of was put to the side, and I got more and more, initiated or involved in the work. I mean, my own work on myself with studying, reading, looking at my dreams, and my work with my analyst, but also I got sort of something. I felt I want to see if this is actually something that I have some sort of talent for, or something that is right for me. And slow conversion. So a few years later, I started to train, and I finished the training in 2017, and now I see patients here in Berlin, and read Jung still, although less frequently these days.
So actually, I do have a question from that, and I will say, we, just for listeners, we previously recorded this conversation, had some technical difficulties, and so we're in the strange position of having the same conversation for a second time. But I will say that I didn't ask this the first time around, so this is already another surprise. 15 years, you say, roughly, that you've been in the Jungian camp, going from an analysand to becoming an analyst, without, I guess, not wanting to pry into your own personal details, but you said you're unhappy. What does the qualitative difference of your life look like between the start and now? Something that you say, a cure, which is of course a difficult word in therapeutic setting to say, I'm going to find a cure, but it's the broad question. What's changed, if you could put your finger on it, from that engagement, or via that engagement?
Well, I think I pay attention to reality in a different way. And I think I pay attention to myself, on a good day at least, in a different way than I did back then. I would hope that I also learned something about myself along the way. I mean, because I spent a lot of time in that room. And then of course, 15 years, my life has changed a lot. Now I have a family, and I'm occupied with a completely different type of work. But of course, some things also has not changed, and I'm not, cured. I have, healed certain parts possibly, but I'm definitely, that connects also to the Christianity and the theme we're going to discuss today. But Jungian psychology might not be, as a colleague told me, maybe it's not the end of the road.
Can with regards to, we have to
maybe in regards to individuation, if you like, or in regards to a person's life. That Jungian psychology can be many different things, and we can talk about that. But it wasn't a cure by itself, and I wasn't cured by an archetype.
So if we were to separate out purely physiological problems, I don't know, an infection which does get a cure and goes away 100%, and problems of the psyche, of culture, of religion, of spiritual crises, is there a cure? Are we ever right in using the word cure within that setting?
I think there is some sort of cure. I mean, maybe not a cure that, gives you eternal happiness or contentment, but I think there's a cure from certain sort of pathologies and certain sort of, should we say, distortions of reality. And I mean, whether it's psychoanalysis or Jungian psychology or other type of forms of psychotherapy, I absolutely see its healing aspect, but I also don't think we should project, maybe the cure, or that there is a cure for the human condition. I mean, no. But definitely, maybe Jung would say you can work through certain complexes that distorts your reality and makes you very unhappy, and the people around you usually. So, I think this is a really interesting conversation. I think a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, he speaks about the dangers of psychological absolutism, or like the dangers, because also it's therapeutic absolutism, that there is this sort of, the cure. So I don't believe in the cure, but I do believe that there is process and progress that's possible. But it might look very different from what you expected or wished for.
So you run this podcast, Psychology and the Cross, which is discussions with Jungian scholars, notably for those that listened to this podcast before, Paul Bishop and Murray Stein, who've both been on here before as guests. So if you're interested in those discussions that I've had, head over to Jacob's podcast and listen to Psychology of the Cross. But the emphasis of your podcast is Jung and Christ, the Psychology and the Cross, as one would imagine. And so why is this section, this part of Jung's work, such a, not only, there's two parts to that, I guess, not only a question and an interest that you find so intriguing that you started a podcast and are writing a book from this podcast, or finished a book from this podcast, but also the fact that from that is clearly the point that there is a depth there, that this isn't simply a quick, Jung wrote one thing at one point on Jung and Christ. This is an ongoing question. So where did this begin for you? Why this interest?
Well, I mean, shortly, I did not grow up Christian, and I did not grow up in a religious household. And I think also when I went into my Jungian analysis and that whole journey, I wasn't honestly, maybe Christianity was the thing I was least interested in regards to world religions. So that's just where I came from. And as things happen, and in my case, through personal experiences, through dreams, through other type of experiences, I had encounters, or I had to sort of start grappling with this with Christianity and Christ, and I also think I understood a few years into the training of Jungian in the Jungian training that in order to understand Jung, I need to understand more about Christianity, because as someone said, Peter Holman wrote, Christianity is the experiential matrix on which his whole foundation, his whole psychology is built on. If you want to understand Jungian psychology, you don't maybe need to, but I needed to go deeper and understand what are the real questions that Jung are asking here, and what is he really wrestling with. And that became quite clear to me, and not only to me, that what he's really wrestling with is Christianity in Christ, and trying to find a way to have faith or believe, or in a time where the answers that Christianity gave was not the right for him, or didn't cure him or heal him or help him. So reading, so I think to understand Jung on a deep level, you need to sort of engage with Christianity on some level. And also, as you know, I mean, his last five big books are on Christianity. Also, the Red Book is about Christ. Not only, I don't want to reduce his work to that, because there's so many other. He was extremely open person, and he's very inspired by Buddhism, Taoism, and alchemy. But Christianity was still, he saw himself as a Christian. He was born and raised a Christian, and he died and was buried as a Christian. So I think, I think it deserves attention, and more attention that's been given to it in our field in the last years. So just to shortly say, it was both individual and subjective and experiential, but also intellectually, if you like, I think I wanted to grapple.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested by that idea of Christianity as the experiential matrix of Jungian thought. Are we to understand that as, with Christianity, we have, not to sound too like a certain contemporary figure who loves Jung, one Jordan Peterson, but are we to say that from this is a structure within which there are archetypal, symbolic places of friction, which in Christianity, us as Westerners, have a grammar with which we can engage with. And what I mean by that practically is, say, sin, redemption, salvation, what it is to be crucified. This is a symbolic grammar from which Jungian psychoanalysis comes alive, because the understandings are completely embroiled with that grammar.
I think that's absolutely one important level to it, that, I mean, Jung's psychology is an attempt to find new words and new ways to speak about old truths, or old new wine in old bottles, or is it old wine in new bottles? Sorry. So that's for sure something that he tried, he worked on maybe, I don't know, smuggling in, question of sin through his concept of the shadow, or, speaking about the persona, maybe connecting to, a false self, or, how we present ourselves to the world. Or his whole work on the self, his whole work on the self is a way of speaking about, the imago Dei, the divine in the human being. So surely that's one part of the experiential matrix, but another part is more maybe human or mundane, and that has to do with Jung's own personal biography. I mean, from being a very small boy, he struggled with and was scared of, and had, ambivalence in regards to religion, and in regards to specifically to Christianity. His father was a priest, and many of his relatives were priests or working within the Swiss Reformed Church. He was, given that type of education, but he was a very sensitive boy who had big dreams or big visions and big fears. And had, experiences that he couldn't, speak about with his parents. So somehow the experiential matrix is also him, I think, trying to come to terms with faith, and the question of faith, or the question of Christianity as he had inherited it or integrated it in himself, from his personal biography. So that's also where it's easy to get lost with Jung. I mean, there's a lot of, when it comes to Christianity, because there's a lot of Jung's biography in his fight with the Christian thoughts, or with God, if you like. From the beginning, in the Red Book until, Answer to Job, but there is, Jung's God was not the God that we necessarily hear preached in the church today.
Who was or even is Christ for Jung?
Well, I mean, Jung, I think the short answer to that would be, or like the standard Jungian answer would be, Christ is a symbol of the self in the Jungian terminology, that Christ is, or Jesus Christ is a symbol of totality, or of wholeness, or of a coming together of opposites, maybe. So Christ is the self, but Jung is also very clear, and he develops this in Aeon, in one of his later books in the 1950s, and he develops this idea along the way. But then that's where he makes it very clear that Christ, in Jung's view, is not the whole image of the self. It's not the image of the whole self. It's a sort of one-sided image of the self that is emphasizing only the light, only the good, only the spirited aspect, if you like, of the human existence. And provocatively as it is, he saw the other side of Christ is the devil.
Mm-hmm.
Or that the devil is or Satan has, that Christ, to be whole, you have to sort of combine, you have to also see Satan as his sort of shadow, if you like, or the dark side. So to answer your question, Christ is a symbol of the self, but it's not the whole self in Jung's view. And there is actually, I have a quote here that I think is kind of fitting. Mm-hmm. Because if you follow Jung, when he writes about Christ, it is in answer to Job and other things, he has one type of way of speaking about Christ, and he's a bit more careful, although he's not very careful in answer to Job in certain regards. But in personal letters, you find often Jung that's more relaxed, and where he can just say what he really thinks, I believe. And in one of the letters he wrote in 1951, around the time when he wrote Answer to Job, he wrote it to a theologian, Adolf Keller. Mm-hmm. He says about Christ, he puts it like this: if Christ means anything to me, it is only as a symbol. As a historical figure, he might just as well be called Pythagoras, Lao Tse, Zarathustra, etc. I find the historical Jesus completely unedifying, simply interesting because controversial. Mm. Again, this is a blunt, version of it.
Well, but it's surprisingly clear for Carl Jung there.
Yeah.
But what does that mean for those that wish or desire to be a Christian? Because that seems there that to follow Christ is not really something you can do in the sense of Christ the individual, but your inner Christ. So to be a Christian is to try and find wholeness?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. I think Jung spent a lot of time in his writing on the concept of imitatio Christi, what you say about following Christ, but the idea of imitation of Christ, which is this book from Thomas à Kempis, 1500. Mm-hmm. And Jung also read that book, and he was interested in that book, and he also picks up that book in the Red Book in an active imagination he's doing, or in a vision he has, however you want to describe it. And he's really trying to understand, what does it mean today, in Jung's time today, to imitate Christ. And he's really working through, already in the Red Book, his own rendering of imitatio Christi. And he warns of a literal imitation of Christ. He says there's risks with imitating Christ, trying to be the good Christian, trying to be, the light, trying to be there for everyone, self-sacrificing. It's like identifying with an archetype. Mm. We've seen those people. We see what happens in the church when people think they are Christ, Mm. There would be a shadow that would be horrible, horrendous. So he was really emphasizing that there's a danger in imitating Christ. And what you need to do to be a Christian today is sort of to be as authentic as Christ was in the way that you live your life. You have to go against the common moral at times, which, and like go into the temple and tear down, what's considered the moral right thing to do for the sake of conscience or for the sake of Christ. So I would say Jung's Christ in its best is a very radical, image of Christ, which he presents as a polar opposite to the Christ that he had heard preached, in his church, when he grew up, which was Christ was all about love. So I think there's something around that sort of rendering, Christ as a rebel, but he definitely doesn't speak about Christ as a savior or as, God's son, who came to this world to save us, or redeemer of souls. that's not. He does speak of Christ as a sort of a man who was maybe taken by an archetype.
A sort of fairly, maybe not so subtle, focus on Christ as the prophet of the Old Testament, as opposed to the revelation of the New Testament. The God of the Old Testament being cruel, full of suffering, and possibly more in line with what Jung would say of one's journey through life.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, also, Jung has an emphasis on the Old Testament God and also Christ, I would say, yes.
So this brings in, for me, if we aren't to imitate in the way of Kempis and also St. Paul in the sense of quite literally a one-to-one sort of rather banal imitation of the actual figure, then from that it seems that there develops some notion of a Christian unconscious. I'm kind of shoehorn that in a bit there, but the notion of an unconscious or a way of being that someone can enter into, which isn't imitation in the usual sense as mimicry, but a broader place from which one can enact that form of Jungian Christianity. And it seems that this place of Christian unconscious, because this brings in questions of of course, the modern world, how are we to be Christians in the modern world with all the secularity? So this sort of brings in like questions of myth and of the unconscious, of what it is that is there already. There's no vacuum. So what myth is there already projecting our lives to not be able to be within the Christian unconscious, or wherever we might be that would take us towards wholeness?
Well, I mean, I think the Christian unconscious, that was also back in the early 30s, that was what Jung was very criticized for later, about speaking about the Christian unconscious or the Jewish unconscious, although Freud did the same thing, and that's the language that was used at the time. I mean, we can discuss about Jung's relationship to National Socialists, that's another thing, and he definitely was very opportunistic in those days. But there is, so I think that the Christian unconscious, I mean, Jung would say that, our unconscious of Westerners, like at least growing up in a Western culture, it has roots that go further back, than our parents, I think he didn't believe that we are born like tabula rasa. He did have an archetypal theory. He did believe that, we are sort of struggling to answer our ancestors' questions, in our lives, the questions that they couldn't themselves resolve. That's how he saw his own life, that he maybe was struggling with questions that his ancestors had not resolved. But so he would say, the unconscious is Christian, but it's kind of like, especially I would say our conscious attitudes are Christian. We are like, how we maybe look at sex, or how we look at our bodies, or how we look at, irrationality, or if you like, that there is something, he would say that there is something that has become sort of one-sided in the Christian myth, in all its emphasis on the sacred nature of the human being, and that there is some shadow, there is something that's been lost in the shadows that Christianity would need to integrate to offer a more fulfilling mythology or story for today's world, or for the psyche. Yeah. So that there is, and he found that himself in alchemy. I mean, alchemy he saw as the field that was sort of representing I think he says like the Christian mysticism, or the undercurrents of the psyche. So that's why he spent a lot of time in alchemy, where he would find images that he saw complementary to let's say the internalized Christian, value system and images, that we are all, he would say, inherited, and that we need to struggle with on some level.
There's something interesting there with what you said about Jung understanding that, I guess, modern day Christianity needs to integrate something to sort of actualize it again as an actual potent factor within the lived world, the experienced world. And this is something actually I've spoken about with Paul Bishop before, on this notion of whether or not the sacred is anywhere at all really within the modern And so I think about, if I'm remembering correctly, Jung was a big fan of the Latin Mass, right, for instance. And we see within the modern world at the moment this, what Spengler would call the second religiosity. A lot of people returning to traditional forms, like highly, highly traditional, ritualized forms of religion, because there is this aesthetic feeling of this is something real, this isn't secular, this isn't consumerism, this is really, really different, and from that feels highly authentic, right? But I think there might be a problem there with the difference between the conscious and the unconscious. So that is a conscious decision that people are making. And I think in doing so, maybe it's all a bit surface level, consciously doing the ritual. But what you said about this, something needs to be integrated. It's something that we shouldn't, as humans, have control of. Right? The sacred is not something we can consciously control. So what do you think this is? I mean, they're just my immediate thoughts. That what needs to be integrated is something unconscious that is ultimately larger than us, some sort of friction that we are not in control of. What do you think it could be that we could look towards or just find that needs to be integrated for that Christian unconscious to become a potent factor for people again?
Well, I think Jung would say, he does some seminars 100 years ago, 1923, in Polsia in Cornwall, where he speaks about the great repressions of ecclesial Christianity, of church Christianity. And he speaks like Christianity has repressed the human animal, it repressed the human nature, it repressed the feminine, it repressed humans' capacity for symbol formation. And by symbol formation, he means like it does not allow the unconscious in an individual to sort of, has life, it has sort of put a symbolical structure, if you like, that should be sort of one size fits all. That might not be true, but Jung would say, where would we go? Where we would start with our dreams. I mean, that's why the emphasis of Jungian analysis is really on dream work, because usually you get a pretty good, quite accurate, I should say, a complementary image sometimes to the conscious values as you speak about, of more aesthetic maybe values, or I want to be a good, or I'm seeking this, I want, while the unconscious would speak, but maybe more about what we need in order to integrate, parts of personality or have a sense of feeling alive in the world. So the focus of analysis today, as it's being practiced, is built on that principle that you are excluding yourself from the world for some time. And if you have the luxury to do so, you go to your therapist or analyst at least twice a week, and you start to really put effort, not only effort, emphasis, attention to what's coming up in your dream life. And you start to work with that material. And that's like on an individual level would be where I would say Jung says that integration is possible. And maybe also where some people will, connect with Christianity. Other people might not connect with that at all. They might have different images. I mean, what's beautiful with Jung's theory is that it is, I would say it's universal, but it works, I work with people with a Muslim background, or with an atheist background, or with a Christian background, and it can be, can lead many ways. But if you start listening to your unconscious, if you start paying attention to it, and if you start reading it and understand it better, I would say that's where you can find a path, through life. And I do believe that it connects to the religious. If you go deep enough into yourself, these religious questions, whichever myth we decide for, will be surfacing. And another way to say is like looking at the symptoms is also what leads you in there. So if we look at, that's also like we studied the symptoms and the symbolical meaning of a symptom. If someone has panic attacks, it's usually not, there is something about like a lack of symbolically also of air or of space, or not being able to set boundaries. So it's a way of attending to the soul, or to the psyche, or to interiority, that I think what's the best thing with Jungian psychology and psychoanalysis is that it's a contemplative practice of studying and partaking in your interiority in a different way.
The unconscious is okay with suffering, or it simply is suffering? Friction, like maybe not suffering. Suffering's a bit too too much of a loaded word. I mean, it has its relationship with Christ, of course, but the unconscious is the place of friction. The conscious mind always seeks to smooth things out, whereas the unconscious will throw things up in dreams, which...
At the beginning, yes, often. I think at the beginning, that's what brings people to therapy. If the unconscious acts out in a symptom, or as I said, in a panic attack, or like, oh, I have all these weird dreams, can you help me to navigate? I don't know why I suddenly dream about this. And so I think the unconscious will scream very loud if there's something that needs to be attended to. But I think maybe as a process continues and goes more onward, it can be, I think Jung was like Steiner, he was holistic in the sense that he saw that conscious and unconscious needs to sort of, work together in finding if it's a middle way or a dialogue. And if you start to weave that dialogue, there might be wholeness or, more appreciation or more openness or more access to your feeling life. So I think Jung, if you compare Jung's and Freud's view of the unconscious, I mean, Freud had a very darker view of the unconscious. Jung was more, he was also seeing the potentials, while maybe in Freud's it's a little bit more, at least in the traditional, like that there is something kind of animalistic there that could be uncontrollable. So I think there's a lot of, but I think finding the balance, as cliche as it sounds, is kind of the path.
Are we to go back to, this idea of the myths that we're abiding by today that are controlling us only? We're too conscious, too rational?
I mean, isn't it the case that we are both too rational, too irrational, or we are irrational in our irrationality? It's just like when I look at the world today, I see people, people coming into my practice, some people are too rational, some people are too irrational. And if I look at the world, I feel like, the balance is sort of out of, maybe a little bit out of place. So I don't know if I would say that, that's my answer, I guess.
Okay. So talking about people, it's a pretty bad segue, but talking about people coming into the practice in your book, this is a quote from Paul Bishop, and he says that Jung puts God on the couch. What do you suppose Bishop means by that, and what's happening in that process, just to bring us back to Christ there? Because we've spoken, it's interesting, right, that Jung, Christianity, Christ as the individual figure, but we actually haven't mentioned the word God yet. So what's happening with God and all this long process?
What's happening with God, you mean in Jung's working through, in Jung's life?
Jung, and I guess for Jung himself, but also for any patient, not any patient, because
I hear you.
We'll begin with Jung himself, I guess.
Well, I mean, I think it's a provocative and probably true way to speak about it, that Jung, at least in answer to Job, sort of puts God on the couch and sort of points him out as being, narcissistic and rageful and, especially sort of ignorant. And that Job is sort of helping God to come to consciousness. And so there is, he's trying to equal out, I think, maybe the relationship between Job and God. And so I think there is something about, and I should say this, he says himself, I don't put God on the couch. He doesn't say it like that, but it's the God image. So he tries to define, it's the God image, it's the imago Dei, it's the self, it's how God is, perceived possibly in an individual. Like, so that he's trying to sort of hold that definition all the time. It's not, I don't speak about God, who I couldn't say anything about God, but I can speak about an image of God, or, within, the psyche, within the soul. So that's how he tries to also defend himself for this common critique of Jung, sort of psychologizing and making God into a little fitting piece in a map of the psyche, Here's the self, here's God. No. I mean, it would be the image of God, or the image of totality, or the image of wholeness working in man, or the imago Dei. So that I think he's quite clear about, that it's no, he's not quite clear. At times he's clear about that it's not God he's sort of wrestling with. But also, as Murray Stein has said and written, like, if you read Answer to Job, it's also a book. It's a book about many things, but one thing, it's also sort of Jung struggling with his own God image. And if we struggle with the God image, usually we struggle with the Father. And usually it's also connected back to our own fathers, or the people who were our authorities. So I'm not saying this to say that all of Jung's fight is a fight with his father, but absolutely, if you want to follow Jung on Christianity, you also get sort of Jung fighting with his father, his real life father, who had a very different, embodiment of faith, if you like. His father was the opposite. He was embodying faith. Faith was the most important thing, while for Jung, knowledge, the gnosis, was was sort of the other component. So Jung's wrestle with Christianity is for sure also wrestled with his own biography, and without reducing his project into that, but saying that's a level of that. And I think Murray Stein is right about that there is a counter-transference. It has a lot to do with Jung's emotional relationship to authority, if you like.
Very an abstract question, because you've mentioned, with respect to, I guess, more modern appreciations of Christ, it would be Christ as love. Many people might see Christ as like this sort of anarchist, political figure, smasher of rules. Many people at certain times would see God, Christ, as, old man in the clouds telling you thou shalt not. And so this question of the image of God, the Imago Dei, if I was to abstractly ask, what do you think the general modern Western image of God that we have looks like? Currently is. Of course, I just want to say, because as you said, this notion of the Father, it's going to differ person to person. But I wonder what you think in terms of that. What that is on a grand scale level. What image are we holding?
Yeah, if I start with Jung, this was really one of his great battles with theologians that had to do with the summum bonum, God as the all-good, or the all-good God, or the all-loving God. That was something that he saw as a very dangerous concept, because for him that meant like evil had no existence, or evil became instead repressed, because evil was not, or darkness was not, sort of perceived as ontological reality, as somewhere. So he was very critical to this summum bonum concept and the privatio boni, and he spent a lot of time in sort of wrestling with that and fighting with people about that, and making a point, which I think is an important point. But in today's time, if I speak about me growing up in Sweden, the most secular country in the world, it is sort of in all these rankings. I was not, Christianity was, perceived as like this infantile fairy tale, like an infantile fairy tale, that's, that was for children. And I think, probably, at least, on the context that I know, people's perception, including my own, of Christianity, especially earlier, was extremely ignorant and extremely one-sided and extremely limited. And very problematic and provocative in my views today. It's like, it was treated like shit, or as something, childish. And speaking of Jung, he always says, like, where should you look for where culture is moving? Look at what the culture treats as shit, or as childish, or as not valuable. So by that, I'm trying to say that I think we have a very unsophisticated, or undifferentiated, or maybe childish, many people view of God, and I think it's needs time and suffering, and to maybe to sort of let loose of those maybe very childlike images of Christ. Having said that, just want to say, of course, there is something about if you have had faith when you grow up, and if I work with someone who had faith when they grow up, there's something usually very beautiful also in the childlike relationship to a God. So I'm generalizing very broadly, but it's a difficult question. I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Well, what I was going to say was, I think the statement from Nietzsche, which is probably arguably the most famous philosophical statement of modern day, that God is dead, I very much, I think I did mention this last time actually, I very much like Slavoj Žižek's retort to that, which is God is dead, but he's very much alive in the unconscious. And that God is absolutely not dead. And so for me, we're talking about this, as you said, Jung saying where to look, the thing that's treated like shit. The fact that this thing is within our unconscious, whatever it might be, this God in general, when you're existing consciously within a society where, as far as I'm concerned, in the West, morals, law, etiquette, maybe even schooling, but I would argue many of our unconscious appreciations of the world are completely guided by Christianity, unconsciously. And yet consciously, you get this, quick axioms from modern day science, which just say that's all nonsense, so you never deal with it, but God is still there in your unconscious. So there's a clash without you actually knowing where the clash is at all. And so it's kind of a dangerous position to be in, is one where I guess you are abstractly unhappy, whatever that word, or discontented, whatever that word might mean. But one of the major places of recourse as to begin to unspool that knot is immediately, that's just ridiculous. It's definitely not there. Don't bother with that. So then you're on that really dangerous road of being on the wrong road entirely. So you're looking for answers where there never will be any. And so that's my general thought, is just the acceptance of, look, I mean, even the statement God is dead kind of negates itself, right? Because it's an acknowledgement of the discussion itself. Those are my general thoughts.
And I think Jung would very much nod to this, or like, yes, because and also to Žižek's, comment. I think that's a very Jungian view, if you like. And I think, again, Jung sort of smuggled in this theological discourse into psychological language and found a way for us to speak about the self or speak about something that's sort of godlike, but without using the word. I must say also, like in my training in Zurich, God was very, very rarely mentioned. I almost dare say. So there is also discourse of the self, or of course there are Christians and there are religious people also studying and training to become Jungians, but there is something about the suspiciously absent, the word God.
Why do you think that was? Even, I mean, that's surprising, especially from what I understand about Zurich. That's quite surprising.
I think it's something. I mean, God is. But probably it's too. Maybe it's too provocative. Maybe it's too old. Maybe it's too asks for a certain submission that we are not, always ready for. Yeah, almost like another cake, but too grand of a word, maybe. And we had other words that we could use that were more comfortable. So I really look also with your work and all of it. I mean, God, to be able to talk about that and to use that word, I think it's important. But I felt, I don't know exactly why it wasn't there, but I think maybe some people, going through a Jungian analysis doesn't need a God. I don't know. Other people do. But it's like, for me, that also became the question. I mean, that I myself, where I felt like the answers I could find were very good, partly for psychological work, but when it came to God and Jung's perception of God and Jung's wrestle with the God image, I often got lost and confused, and that's why I started the podcast to try to learn from people who spent more time than myself on this, and then starting to write this book together with to try to answer some of these questions.
So it's often said that no one worships nothing. No one worships nothing. There's no vacuum in that sense. Do you think even atheists, everyone has a God? Or do you think there is a much more specific thing in a Jungian sense that God is? Because the question of atheism with respect to Jungian analysis is an intriguing one, especially regards the amount of symbology and myth that's involved. But do you think, in terms of, Jung, that God is a specific thing? It couldn't enter into that whole idea of, well, if you don't worship, this God, then you worship money, or you worship fame, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I mean, Jung would say something very similar. I think that, God is sort of what we put our energy into, or what we put our commitment into, whether that is money, as you say, progress, or family, or, or a Christian God that's not your own, your own God. So, like, I think on that level, Jung would be, quite similar to how you expressed it. But yeah, I don't know. There was another piece of that question? No, another part.
Well, yeah, just I guess the question also is that I sometimes find that appropriation a bit. It plays around with the word God in the sense that just completely overhauls what God traditionally is. So you might say that someone is putting their energy towards money, but I also would say that they're not going to a church of money and explicitly getting on their knees and praying to money itself, in the sense that, so, does Jung still retain some more traditional aspects of what a god is in that sense?
But he speaks about the religious instinct, that there is a religious instinct in man, and like on a deeper level, and that's this sort of longing for individuation, or longing for wholeness, or longing for salvation, if you like. So I think he would speak probably more about like where you attend to, where you attend your energy, and so like I think God is, as we know, it can be as destructive as a concept as it can be uplifting. So I think Jung was, as a psychologist, or trying to sort of use this psychological persona as a psychiatrist, he at times tried to avoid using the word God too much, and maybe developed then this concept, if you like, of the self, which is I wouldn't say a concept, but I mean it's an experience as well, to get more people to be able to open up, and maybe to a different path.
Speaking of a path, and you mentioned that individuation, just to bring this back to Christ, maybe this is a little two-dimensional, but with respect to this Christian unconscious, this Jungian form of imitation of Christ, is it such that each path, if it is one of true individuation and not individualism, if it's individuation, are we all heading towards our own crucifixion? And if so, as per the name of your podcast, what does the cross look like in that process of individuation?
Well, he would definitely say that crucifixion is a part of the story, and the cross is a part of any story of individuation, and also a part of any life, of course. So the cross is essential, just as suffering is essential for Jung, not as only a bad thing that should be removed, but can be neurotic, it can be bad, but it can also be bringing consciousness, suffering and the cross, and holding the opposites of, the psyche, if you like, the unconscious and the conscious, and sort of waiting on the cross for a dream, or for an image, or for something that can move you along the journey. So I don't know if I would say, I would say if it's the end of the journey, but I would say that the crucifixion is unfortunately, maybe, or fortunately, I think necessary part of what Jung would call an individuating journey, or along the path of wholeness. I mean, Jung speaks about individuation in different ways depending on when you read him, but it is this idea also becoming who you are, as Nietzsche would say, to become who you are. That's also he took from Nietzsche. It's like it's a process of becoming who you are, but he doesn't say like it's about becoming who you are in front of God, for example, that Kierkegaard probably would say, probably he would say. So so Jungian psychology can be used and misused, but I think when done right, it's like a soul work, and it's like a tradition of soul work, and of cultivating the soul and cultivating attention to interiority. And again, I also meet with patients who have been who are suffering from Christianity and suffering from upbringings where Christianity has been implemented and lived in such a destructive way for the soul and for the development that it's just appalling. So, but my sense with Jung's work on Christianity, maybe I'm jumping ahead now, but I want to say my understanding of Jung's whole work is a wish for, or maybe an unfinished work of wanting to reform Christianity and wanting to bring in again what Christianity through years of church has repressed, and bring that back into Christianity so that it can be a seed for the future. And that's how he speaks in his last works. He's really speaking of Christianity as something extremely valuable. But there is something very true and valuable in this myth, but it's just how it's understood or lived that is critical towards, just as Kierkegaard again, like Christendom as something distorting, the mystical and original truth of this story.
Do you think that that Jungian approach to it as a myth, as a Christian unconscious, as this question of how to bring it forward, do you think that could be mistaken at times for a familiarity which itself actually damages our relationship to Christianity? That one could get too familiar with the divine, and of course Jung is a Gnostic of sorts, dare I say it, or at least, or let me step, well, I'm not a scholar, but Jung has a very deep interest in Gnosticism, I'll just say that. And so this familiarity, this approach seems to really be walking a tightrope between traditional ceremonial Christianity on one side, where one does have the image of God and they're not God, they're still an individuated individual in God's kingdom. But then just on the other side, just every now and again, with this familiarity comes the Gnostic vision where one is God, one is the individual God of themselves. And Jung often doesn't do himself any favors on that tightrope.
No, exactly. It's a tightrope. It's a tightrope for anyone, I think. Absolutely, I think Jungian psychology can be so intoxicating and inflating and, lead to something like that. But in my experience, when it's done right, it doesn't lead necessarily to Christianity or to Buddhism or anything, but it leads to a cultivation of the capacities for reflection and feeling and experiencing the world. And usually with that comes more humility, or more, actually, not that you're, as James Hillman said, like, analysis is not about growth, it's about shrinkage. Like, finding the right size in regards to the divine, if you like, or in regards to God or nature. And I think, there's a lot of, you also find a lot of humility in Jung at times, and at other times he's just like maybe becoming that God or that agnostic sort of. So, but in my experience, like, it's really important, I think, as a Jungian or as an analyst to be agnostic, agnostic, not gnostic, and be very, very open to that everyone is, everyone's path. And so there's dangers, and there are, I think there are absolutely dangers in this field, but I also think it brings a lot of worth and value for people who suffer. But that's beyond the question of Christianity. That's just like as a practice in itself, to be heard and to be seen and to be loved and to be cared for and to learn to do that for oneself. That is what one is going through in the process of therapy or analysis.
Where would you advise people to begin reading with respect to this question of Jung and Christianity? Of course, we've got your own book, which is, when's this going to be released? Well, your own book is it's a series of conversations on Jung and Christianity. So, a lot of information in one place. When is this going to be released?
It's going to be released 19th of August, but it's already available for pre-release. So if you order it today, you actually get it shipped from the publisher. So the book is called Siggy Jung, Face-to-Face with Christianity. Face-to-Face with Christianity, it's connected to an interview Jung did in the 1950s. That's quite famous, with John Friedman on BBC, where he was asked the question, "Do you believe in God?" And he was thinking for a second or half a minute, and I said, "Complicated question. I don't believe, I know." And of course, very criticized and bombarded by things and felt misunderstood. But so Face to Face with Christianity is the name of the book. And I think, I think it's my hope with the book and the conversations is that it should be a good introduction to Jungian Christianity. If you want to otherwise, I would turn to Murray Stein, possibly. I mean, he's the one who written most in this field, and he written Jung's treatment of Christianity, which is a classic, and where he proposed the thesis that Jung was trying to put God on the couch, put Christianity on the couch, and sort of find a treatment for it. Beautiful book, a very important book for me. But what I'm trying to do in this book with these different voices and in the introduction is to get a maybe broader, hopefully maybe more neutral sort of as an image on some level of what was Jung really trying to do and why is this important for us today?
And what are you working on? Are you still working on the podcast? And
yeah, I mean, now with the book, there's going to be a few things happening around that. And then I'm preparing lectures for Zurich next year. There's a big Jungian showdown, like the big conference happening there. So I'm going to try to explore the question about the driving the myth onward, or like this question of what is Jung really, implying in his later works, especially his last essays, where he speaks about the Christianity as the sort of seed of the future. And I sense that there is something, I guess I would like to write and work on something that really works with our time, because I think one misunderstanding of Jung is that he's sort of this mystical person who's just focusing on the inside, like go inside and you would find all the truths, of the world, and that's absolutely not true. And it has taken me time to understand this. But again, if you look at his last essays, The Undiscovered Self, his work on UFOs, which people laugh about, but it's quite interesting work, The Psychological View of Conscience, and other articles he wrote at the end of his life, they really deal with society. They deal with society and what's the role of individuation in a world that is looking like it does. This was written in the 50s, and in the 50s it was the Cold War, and it was atom bombs and fear of big nuclear war lying in the background. Our time is different, but also similar with all the threats. So I have a sense that Jung's social conscience is something that needs more attention, and I hope to be able to plow in that field, or what you say. Yeah.
Well, is there anything you'd like to add about our conversation that you feel we've missed?
No, just that a conversation like this, of course, it becomes short, and some of these are very complex, and I feel like maybe just one of your questions we could spend an hour on. So, but hopefully it's a good introduction of sorts.
Well, I'll be sure to put the links for your podcast and for the book in the description below. But Jakob Lusensky, it's been great. Thanks very much.
Thank you.